Thanks, Stephen. Oh, this works. I'm pretty technologically challenged, so if anything bad happens, wave at me, and we'll get the experts out to fix it, because I won't be able to. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. I was speaking this weekend at the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society on a similar topic, but what I'd like to do is talk for about 35 minutes or so, and then take questions afterwards. Pour mes auditeurs francophones, je parle entièrement en anglais, mais je suis heureux de répondre à vos questions en français après la présentation. So, my first big challenge here, there we go, it works. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking about systemic obstacles in achieving ethical excellence in D&D. And I will approach this topic the same way that I have in my latest research, and there's a handout around if you want to see that, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that afterwards. And so what I've been looking at in a number of different domains is how systemic barriers in the CAF and D&D culture have impeded desired culture change. Like other organizational problems, ethical failings are often blamed on a few individuals, the so-called bad apples. But systemic factors are usually more pervasive and can cause greater damage to the organization than individual misbehavior. Furthermore, systemic factors are generally more difficult to address because they are rooted in the organization's culture. I've also been asked to address some of the things there, CAF culture, ethics, military ethos, relevance of fighting spirit in the ethos, actual CAF social dynamics, and the goal of gender integration. Gee, I could run a whole course, a year-long course on that, but I'll do my best to whip through it now. But again, I'm easy to get a hold of. Stephen knows how to get a hold of me, or you can just go to the Queen's History Department online. Happy to take questions here and later. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the gender integration thing, but I did write a paper that my presentation was based on for the IUS conference on, guess what? Systemic barriers to achieving comprehensive culture change dealing with sexual misconduct in the CAF. So if you want more details on that, I'll send the paper to Stephen, and or if you want to ask me directly, I can send it to you. So I'm going to begin by discussing what I consider to be a fundamental issue in all organizational change discussions, and that's culture. I will be talking more about CAF culture than D&D civilian culture because this is my area of expertise and it's the focus I've been asked to make today. Now, culture has been called the bedrock of military effectiveness because it influences everything an armed forces does. How armed forces fight, actually, there's a lot of historical research to demonstrate that they tend to fight and operate more a function of their culture than their doctrine. And as one senior Army officer friend of mine said when they'd done a magnificent change to the doctrine, but we were sort of scratching our heads to why, he said, don't worry, nobody reads that. Anyway, so that's the thing about people that parse the doctrine and read the doctrine really carefully. I mean, it tells you what the organization's thinking, but they don't often do it. It's more about their culture. And so when we talk about culture, the keys to deciphering cultural behavior are these two concepts here, espoused values and values in use. Because they help us understand why differences in value systems within organizations exist and why doctrine may not be followed. Now, when I teach this concept, I always ask my class to, you can do this here, it's a little exercise. Think about an organization you know really, really well. It could be the military, it could be a social group, it could be a club or anything. And then think about what the organization says it's going to do and then what it actually does. And it's been fascinating in civilian classes to find that really any organization you can think of has things they say they do and then what really goes on in the organization. And the example I always use, of course, is RMC, because I was a graduate from there. So I think many of you may be familiar with the espoused values of RMC, which are truth, duty, valor. And of course, anyone that's been to the place knows that the values in use are truth, duty, valor, and don't get caught. And don't get caught. And the funny thing is, I was doing a class at Queen's, and so I was doing this example. I had truth, duty, valor, and then we got to don't get caught. And they were all civilians, but there was one actually military guy who was an RMC grad, came in late. And he walked in, looked at the board, because there was no RMC there, just truth, duty, valor, don't get caught. He said, "Oh, RMC, right?" And so it's universal there, and every organization is like that. Now, I'll just give you an example from our recent history of espoused values and values in use related to the sexual behavior of Canadian military personnel serving in Afghanistan, where condoms were freely available to all personnel, even though sexual activity was prohibited for those deployed in the theater of operations. Interestingly, for a historian, when they made this statement, the second statement, they said they justified it by referring to what our medical personnel had done in the First World War to prevent STIs. So nothing like a little historical precedent to cover up. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is culture change. And the point I want to make here is that culture is organic in nature. It's not like a piece of military hardware where components can be replaced or modified at will. It is more like a plant that needs to be nurtured and cared for, including pruning diseased parts, if it is to thrive and bear fruit. Also, in the second or last point there, a culture change is what they call a wicked problem that cannot be successfully addressed by a linear step-by-step planning process. And wicked problems are really complicated problems, and we had great discussions on the weekend when I was pointing out that culture change related to sexual misconduct in the Canadian Forces is a wicked problem. Operation Honor is a linear solution applied to a wicked problem. It's not a bad start, but we know from historical example that it is very unlikely to solve a wicked problem. And that's in my paper in more detail if you want to see that. Next, I would like to address the concepts of fighting spirit and warrior culture in a CAF context. So we'll start with ethos. Now this is underlying every culture is its ethos, and so I'm going to talk about the Canadian military ethos first. Now, ethos can be defined as the characteristic spirit of a group. And this, I'll repeat that, because if anyone will ask you for a definition of ethos, if you can remember characteristic spirit of a group, that's the dictionary definition. And this applies to, and I'm now going to modify this a little bit by using when we talk about values, there's an actual ethos and an ethos in use. And the espoused ethos, if you like, is described this way in Duty with Honor. The three components of the Canadian military ethos, according to Duty with Honor, are 1, beliefs and expectations about military service, 2, Canadian values, and 3, Canadian military values, noting that the two will have some overlap, but not entirely. Now, one of the problems with official documents, and I've been looking at this over the last 30 years, about CF ethos, is that they usually confuse espoused ethos with ethos in use. In other words, they give what they would like the ethos to be, and then they just assume that that's going to happen. But since the two can be quite different, I think really in the future we should make clear that this is what we'd like the ethos to be, but ethos is different from ethics, right? Ethics is a code of conduct or a set of rules about how to behave. And ethos is just the characteristic spirit or how people generally act. So it's much more vague. And so what we really need to do, and this has been one of the problems in the past, is we've got a lot of information on what the espoused ethos is, but we have very little research in Canada on what the actual ethos in use is. And this is something we get some insights into when we get reports of the Somalia Commission and whatnot. But there's certainly, it's a wide open research field. So this leads to another point that I've been asked to address, the question of the relevance of fighting spirit in the CAF ethos. Now, the only mention of fighting spirit in Duty with Honor is this, from 2003. So since then, this expression has become closely linked to how one defines the warrior culture in the context of the CAF. But this was not the case when Duty with Honor was first published 13 years ago. There was only one mention of warrior in Duty with Honor, and it is in a quote from Michael Ignatiev's The Warrior's Honor in the section titled The Reward, let's see, lost my place there, The Reward of Professionalism Honor. Now, note in this piece on Canadian warrior culture, the warrior's honor, note the emphasis on fighting with restraint and discipline in the Canadian warrior culture. As you can see here, when Duty with Honor first appeared in 2003, the only references to fighting spirit and warriors were in the context of how to act honorably and appropriately in the practice of the profession of arms. And it's reinforced really by the title of the book, Duty with Honor. And there are lots of historical reasons for that, dating back, of course, to the Somalia inquiry. So, this leads to my next point about the sexualized warrior culture. Now, these espoused concepts of professionalism and honor have been replaced by what Justice Marie Deschamps described as, quote, an underlying sexualized culture in the CAF that is hostile to women and LGBTQ members, unquote. And this was not addressed by the chain of command, which was, again, according to Justice Deschamps, quote, mostly interested in protecting itself from the negative effect of a complaint on the reputation of leaders in the unit, and is less concerned with protecting the well-being of complainants, unquote, reinforcing what she called the masculine and sexualized culture that already existed. Now, this culture change was officially sanctioned by General Hillier when he was Chief of the Defense Staff, when he stated that one of his goals of his transformation was to replace what he perceived to be the dominant CF managerial and bureaucratic culture with a renewed warrior culture. However, this culture was an artificial American cultural construct, and I discuss that in my book, a little bit of shameless self-promotion here, but I'm going to give you just a really brief summary. The details of how that American culture arose is in there. Now, there are many examples of warrior cultures in history and around the world, but the CAF chose to emulate a hyper-masculine, sexualized American model that was created in the 1990s to justify the exclusion of LGBTQ persons from the U.S. military, and later it was repurposed to exclude women from combat roles, especially in the United States Army and Marine Corps. Not surprisingly, this infusion of a foreign warrior culture into the CAF has undermined programs to promote gender integration and reduce sexual harassment in the CAF. This is reflected by the fact that plans made in 1994 to address the gender imbalance in the CF were exemplified by targets set in 1998 by the Army and Navy of an annual intake of women of 25% to obtain the critical mass for training and employment. That's the term they used. And these plans have had, as you can see, little or no success despite being in place for over 20 years. It was reported in 2013 that the CAF wanted to reduce targets for the number of females in uniform from 25% to 15% because it has been unable to meet, quote, unrealistically high, unquote, goals. However, even though the goals, originally set 17 years ago, have sometimes been met in the past, and I talked about this in more detail at the IUS conference, happy to talk more about it later, no research appears to have been done to investigate how these successes were achieved. Okay, next I'm going to look at organizational change and social dynamics in the CAF. This topic is being widely discussed today, especially with Operation Honor underway, to effect comprehensive culture change called for by Justice Deschamps in her report on sexual misconduct in the CAF. So I'm going to be examining some different ways of looking at cultures that impact on how we plan and implement change, as well as how we interpret social dynamics in a culture. First, I'm going to bore you all with a bit of theory that argues that culture can be viewed in three different ways, as described by Canadian anthropologist Donna Winslow. It's actually worth looking at this because you'll see very quickly why, I hope. So the first is the integration perspective, and this is the one that's most common in the military culture literature, and it's been used almost exclusively by the CAF. It portrays organizations as having a single culture that can be defined, as having identifiable values and norms that are generally shared by all members of the organization. This is the approach articulated in Operation Honor, and while it is valid, it is only one way of looking at CAF culture. So in this approach, organizations are assumed to be integrated wholes, normally stable, and operating based on consensus. Leaders implement cultural change in a top-down manner, for example, by changing the vision statements or by introducing new policies. And of course, this is precisely what Operation Honor started out doing, though interestingly, the CDS in his latest Canadian Military Journal article mentioned that culture change cannot be implemented just top-down and there had to be some bottom-up, but he didn't elaborate, so hopefully we'll get some more on that. The next approach is what's called the differentiation approach. Now, this perspective portrays organizations as composed of many different groups, each with its own subculture. So in this model, the CAF could be visualized as a discrete collection of subcultures based on the values and norms of each community. So no surprise to this audience, Army, Navy, Air Force, what we call the purple communities, and now SOF and legal and logistics and on, are all subcultures that have their own values and norms. And then you can get down even further in the Army, particularly where regiments have subcultures. One of the examples I remember most was when I was teaching the Advanced Military Studies course, and this was mainly colonels, and I had this slide up, I think, and in the discussion period, one of the colonels said, you know, the way I remember that, he said, I had a battle group once that was composed of both RCR and Vandus. And he said, I knew I had a problem when the RCRs started complaining and the Vandus stopped complaining. And I thought, wow, what a great way to illustrate a culture difference. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what he said. So in this model, social dynamics and culture change can be seen as interactions among discrete groups over various issues. Now, the last one's the trickiest, but I think in a lot of ways it's the most valuable. It portrays organizations as a loose structure of various groups whose membership overlaps and whose members may coalesce in different ways based on the issue at hand. So the key point here is that this is issue-focused. So in the integration, it's all one big group. In the subculture, the differentiation model, it's by identifiable subunit. In this one, it's by issue. So you can have a group of people, no matter what units they're in, recombining into another group based by occupation, gender, by age, by geographical location. I mean, the one I'll give is, you know, if you're going to make changes in the pension rules or something that favor older people in the Canadian Forces, you're going to see a group coalesce of older people and younger people that have maybe nothing else in common. And this can happen according to the fragmentation perspective on any issue. So because ambiguity is the operating principle in this perspective, leaders who try to implement change may get unintended results due to complicated, tangled interactions in formal organizations. And this goes back to the wicked problems. The example I used to use at CFC, I said, so when you ladies and gentlemen all become senior officers, just remember, if you only use the integration model where it's top down and there are levers that you can pull to change the culture, just remember those levers you pull on might not be attached to anything. And that's the fragmentation perspective. So the message to take away from this brief theoretical overview is that organizational culture can be viewed in three different ways, and each has some merit. But in order to understand military culture fully, we have to be aware of how each can contribute to our understanding. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to look at is the difference between trades or occupations and professions. So trades and occupations on one side and professions over here. So this is really key, I think, in terms of talking about DND now, not the CAF, as we'll see. Because I'm going to talk about professions in its legal and social context, as opposed to colloquial usage. So you hear the term all the time, well, so-and-so does their job professionally. And that's a term that people use. It means they do their job well, ethically and whatnot, but they're not necessarily a profession or a professional, or more precisely, a member of a profession. Okay? So, in Duty with Honor, the CAF's Profession of Arms Manual, and in the scholarly literature, these other points are prominent. Each profession, for example engineering, has a unique, systematically acquired body of knowledge with higher institutions of learning, universities, adding to and modifying the body of knowledge. Another characteristic of professions is that formal credentials are required for entry into the profession, usually a university degree plus apprenticeship. So for an engineer, it'd be like a B-Eng, and then you apprentice, say, for a year, and then you get your P-Eng. Now, the key in all of this is in return for useful, ethical service to society, professions are given a legal monopoly to do certain work, plus independence, which includes self-regulation, such as the right to set standards for entry into the profession and professional disciplinary powers. So these definitions allow us to see culture in a way that impacts directly on how ethical behavior may be interpreted differently by different groups or subcultures in DND. So what we're going to look at now is the difference between professional and bureaucratic cultures. And the reference for this is Snyder, and he's one of the references I have in other readings. He's got a great article on this, and I highly recommend it. So the main differences between the cultures of a profession and a bureaucracy are essential to understanding ethical behavior in a large, complex organization like DND. No implication is made here that one culture is better than the other. Cultures exist to provide guidelines for acceptable behavior. Therefore, each evolves to suit its own work environment. Professions, like the Canadian Profession of Arms, are characterized by values-based cultures, where responsibility and accountability are founded on trust, whereas bureaucracies are characterized by rules-based cultures, where work is conducted in a highly structured, task-driven, relatively low-trust environment. I want to make it clear here that, sure, professions have rules and bureaucracies have some discretion, but the key is where the emphasis is. And the emphasis for professions is independence, values-based discretion in decision-making, whereas in bureaucracies, the emphasis is on following the rules. So bureaucrats work in a closely supervised environment. They have limited discretionary authority. And in a bureaucratic culture, transactional leadership, that is, leaders using rewards and punishment to get compliance from subordinates, prevails. Now, I'd like to emphasize that in DND, this is not a civilian bureaucrat versus military professional dichotomy. Professionals working as bureaucrats must conform to the rules-based ethical culture. So many professionals can work in audit branches or in places where they're actually working in a bureaucracy, and then they're bureaucrats. When they're working as professionals, then they're professionals. So this is not a civilian military thing. This is a role-based, whether you're working in a professional role, as defined by being a member of a legally recognized profession, or working in a bureaucratic role. The problem, and this is the one that General Hillier was trying to address, and it was quite valid, I think, is that if the norms of a bureaucratic culture are allowed to flourish in a military, they create a top-down, legalistic, compliance-oriented climate, and it's more bureaucratic than professional. And when I get to the latest Code of Ethics manual, that's where this will come in. So, based on these concepts, I want to look at some implications for the Defense Ethics Code. The issue of different professional and bureaucratic cultures can be complex, as you see from this illustration. And this sort of a more detailed summary of what I just said. The discussion is further complicated because among professional cultures in DND, so obviously within DND there are doctors, lawyers, engineers who can be civilians or military, the members of the Canadian profession of arms, and according to Duty with Honor, that's all members of the profession of arms, from private to general, unlike the Americans who define, for the most part, mainly officers as military professionals. So all members of the Canadian Armed Forces are part of a unique military culture because of the unlimited liability members assume on joining, as well as its characteristics of fighting spirit and warrior ethos. There's another whole complication in there that I'm not going to get into. I do in longer lectures, but I'd be happy to discuss afterwards, and it's within Duty with Honor, and it's this idea of dual professionals. So when you talk about, for example, the one that I always use is medical officers who are in uniform, and the fact that military medicine is different than medicine in the military. Sounds a bit, the short answer to that is medical officers who are in uniform are expected to practice medicine for the benefit of the organization, whereas in private practice, it's always for the benefit of the patient, in theory. But we don't have time to get into a long discussion on that. What I want to talk about next is this idea of codes of ethics. And as a result of reforms following the Somalia scandal, the Defense Ethics Program produced an excellent reference, in my view, for members of the profession of arms, which was the cornerstone of CF professional military education and ethics and education for over 15 years. And I was happy to use this. I thought it was a great reference. Now, I'll state up front, even though it is the fundamentals of Canadian defense ethics, it was in fact really intended for the profession of arms, and that caused some problems. It was an operations-oriented, values-based document. Now in 2012, the DND and CF Code of Values and Ethics replaced it, and the new document is a largely bureaucratic, rules-based approach to ethics, tracing its origins to the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, which came into force in April 2007, and which emphasizes, quote, the disclosure of wrongdoings, unquote. However, ethics in the professions, especially the profession of arms, are far more than the disclosure of wrongdoings. And the new document provides little guidance for those in D&D who are members of the values-based profession of arms. Not surprisingly, the new document, given its bureaucratic origins, reflects ethics in a bureaucratic culture. At a time when Canada's military is engaged in combat operations overseas, where they have taken and inflicted casualties, the fact that the chapter called Values and Ethics in Operations is blank should trouble us, at least I think it should, as this means that there is no longer an authoritative CAF-wide document to provide education and training to members of our profession of arms who will face ethical challenges and dilemmas on operations. Now, you know, it may be that if I were asked to contribute to that chapter, I'd really scratch my head and say, how are we going to do this? Because you've started off with a manual that's rules-based and bureaucratic-based, and now you're asking me to write a chapter that's values-based. And, you know, I wouldn't know how to do that. So I tell you, just, you know, on the record, because everything is here, I frankly think we're probably better to go back to 2 manuals, and one would be a values-based professions manual, and I think that 2002 document, Fundamentals, would be an excellent starting place. And then the current one might be very good for a bureaucratic-based document. So for those in bureaucratic roles, and again, it could be civilians or military, boom, you've got your bureaucratic ethics, and then over here you've got your professional ethics. Well, actually, let me be more specific. Professional ethics for the profession of arms, because it is, Fundamentals is specific that way. Okay, now let's assume that we've got all the ethics right. I want to talk about systemic obstacles to achieving ethical excellence in DND. And this is the latest thing I've been presenting. In fact, virtually every presentation I've given in the last couple of months has started out with systemic obstacles. And there are a whole bunch of them, and what I try and do is pick and choose among the ones that I think are most applicable to the given situation. So that's what you're going to get here. But I'm really, if I'm on a bandwagon now, it's about systemic obstacles. Because you can do as much as you can, and it's a very worthy aim to make people behave better as individuals, but if you put systemic obstacles in their path, you may actually prevent them from acting ethically, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. First, I'm going to talk about trust, because it's the common theme in all of this. Now, recent U.S. studies remind us that professional status and privileges are accorded to certain groups, for example, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists, and the military, by societies in return for the effective and ethical application of their specialized knowledge. In the case of the Canadian military profession, the task to which it applies its specialized knowledge is the conduct of military operations, quote, using appropriate levels of military force, unquote, as directed by the government. And recent American research has demonstrated that the cumulative effect of systemic factors to be discussed next has been the erosion of leader-led trust relationships within and among units in the U.S. Army, thereby endangering its status as a profession, and that the U.S. Army faces major challenges in building and maintaining the culture of trust essential to professional behavior. And Snyder, the reference I gave you, tells us that both internal and external trust is what he calls the currency of the professions. This is especially true of the military profession, since this duty with honor tells us, quote, in no other profession in Canada can a member be legally ordered into harm's way, unquote. This means, for it to work effectively, trust must exist among Canadian military professionals, and Canadian society must trust its military to do its work ethically and well. However, as the CAF discovered during the Somalia scandal of the 1990s, any profession that forfeits society's confidence in its ability to exercise its professional duties ethically may face the prospect of losing its privileges of autonomy and self-regulation. The behavior in the Somalia mission that shook Canadian society's confidence in its armed forces was due to, quote, systemic or institutional faults, unquote, in the CF that contributed to, quote, manifold and fundamental, unquote, leadership failures by some senior officers, including, quote, rampant careerism, deeply flawed oversight and supervision of crucial areas of responsibility, unquote. So these are the sorts of systemic things I'm talking about. The Somalia Commission says there may have been a few bad apples, but most people were good people trying to act ethically. And the problem was there were lots of things in the system that were really forcing them into unethical behavior if they wanted to get ahead. The United States military has 35 years of research on that, and it's worth reading. And we really don't know in the CF today. We really haven't done enough research to the detail the Americans have. And it goes back to this thing of, individual actions can definitely be a problem, but the systemic ones are pervasive. And they're the most difficult to address because they're rooted in the culture. So I'm going to examine what I consider are the three most significant ones. And I'm going to start off with the first one, which is resource-mission mismatch. And this comes actually from the American literature. So resource-mission mismatch occurs when governments and higher headquarters demand more from units than can possibly be achieved given the resources allocated to them. And I love that U.S. Army study that I gave there for those at the back in case you can't read it. I mean, they did a study. They went across the U.S. Army and they found that company commanders were expected to fit 297 days of mandatory requirements into 256 available training days. And what they showed is, oh, by the way, all the company commanders were being assessed on getting all the training done. So guess what they did? They did what the United States Army calls checking the box or pencil whipping the requirements. And it just meant they said people did training that they didn't do. And again, the Giras and Wong report is excellent on that. So what results in all of this is that the start of the breakdown in trust in military organizations begins at the highest levels, when governments demand more tasks than they are willing to fund, and when senior military leaders imbued with a can-do attitude and often seeking out roles to justify funding increases or prevent funding cuts take on more than they know they can do. This effect then trickles down to smaller units until we have what we see in the last bullet there. So resource-mission mismatch is an example in the studies of ethical climate in the U.S. Army that has resulted in what Wong and Giras call a loss of moral compass, as the U.S. Army reward system sets conditions that make it impossible to achieve all the organization's stated goals. I think we in Canada would do well to pay attention to this research when assigning new unresourced tasks to the units. And my colleague, Brigadier General Joe Sharp, who was at the conference with me, we sort of looked at each other and we said, we don't have a lot of research, but I can tell you at the Canadian Forces College, when we were talking there and talking about these sorts of things and change fatigue, I mean, right after in question period, we get this rush of students coming up and saying, that's exactly what happened at my unit. We got 3 new tasks and no new resources. So we hear a lot about it, but we don't have any research to document it. So the ethical shortcomings caused by resource-mission mismatch has impinged on many aspects of U.S. Army culture, especially its performance evaluation system, thereby destroying the internal professional trust required to maintain a profession of arms. For over 4 decades, it has been documented how the U.S. Army promotion system encourages some dysfunctional behaviors that have influenced its culture adversely. The 2 long-standing ones identified in the literature, and I mentioned them in my book, are micromanagement and zero defects reporting. The same types of dysfunctional behaviors have been found in Canada, as despite the emphasis on mission command in CAF doctrine, its culture also supports and rewards micromanagement, with fiscal responsibility being used to justify extreme forms of micromanagement by some leaders in DND. And having talked to some people at RMC who had to get approval from the deputy minister to go to a conference, I'll just stop there. The same type of dysfunctional behaviors have been found in Canada, as I mentioned. Now, in addition, the CF evaluation and promotion process often rewards change for change's sake. In fact, Operation Honors call to, quote, institutionalize culture change, unquote, was actually implemented many years ago with a lot of unintended negative consequences. So I think, as most people in this audience know, during their 2 to 3 year tenure in command positions, leaders must demonstrate that they have initiated change, but rarely are they held accountable for those change initiatives that fail because they have moved on to other positions, often promoted for their initial energy in getting something started. The result has been there's been little coherence in CF organizational change over the last 30 years as new leaders produce their own vision and strategy for change, and there is no incentive to continue ongoing change activities. So when I talked, and I've given this lecture for years at the Canadian Forces College, I said really what you need to do is change your personnel evaluation systems so that you actually evaluate people differently depending on what phase of a change program they're in. So you want some planners and initiators, some implementers, and some evaluators. And so everybody's got a role and they come into the job. So, hey, your job is to start a project, your job is to keep it going, your job is to keep it going, and your job is to evaluate it. So you get 4 commanders who might get 4 different types of evaluation. But it doesn't work that way nowadays. Everybody gets rewarded for initiating change, and so you can guarantee you're going to get change. So the other problem with reward systems is that too often, especially with culture change, they measure rewards or inputs that can be measured. For example, number of courses given, number of town halls held, etc., and not outputs. That is, changes in behaviors and attitudes, because it is harder to measure these outputs and because demands for quick and decisive action limit the time available to leaders to implement change. That being said, any output measurement system must encourage honest reporting, something that can be subverted by a number of institutional factors, as we saw with the previous examples. Okay, so the final barrier I'm going to talk about is one that occurs in many guises in Canadian military history, but lately it's been expressed like this. Now, no one would argue with the fact that the CAF's raison d'etre is the conduct of military operations as directed by the government, as noted earlier. However, when the term operations primacy is used as a slogan to cut or curtail what the CDS and others have called institutional enablers, such as professional military education, data collection and analysis programs that are crucial to the long-term health of the organization, then the term operations primacy becomes dysfunctional. Also, and this is right out of the CDS's latest article in the Canadian Military Journal that caused actually a very interesting discussion because the public relations colonel that had actually ghostwritten a lot of it, we were having an interesting discussion because I pointed out that the CDS had, mentioning Operation Honor, had said that in the past, quote, operational priorities, unquote, have displaced initiatives like Operation Honor despite the fact that it was an operational issue because it was only a, quote, institutional imperative, unquote. And I said, boy, you can parse that a lot of different ways because I'm not sure what the real difference between an operational priority and an institutional imperative is. And the poor PR guy was shaking his head. But I said it's clear that whenever you put operational in front of something, it's going to take priority over anything else. So cuts are often justified by the term that you see here, tooth-to-tail ratio, as used as a metaphor to describe the nature of armed forces as having 2 components: fighters, the teeth, and support personnel, the tail. Conventional wisdom has it that armed forces should maximize their teeth and minimize their tail. This wonderful little internet thing came up. However, even this toothy predator has more than just teeth and a tail. And the flawed logic in this metaphor is clear when we consider that all higher order animals are composed of a complex biological system that includes a brain, nervous system, cardiovascular system, lungs, digestive system, and immune systems, and so on. The definition of fighting spirit given earlier included the phrase, quote, everything members of the profession of arms do must focus on achieving success in military operations, unquote. However, everything in fighting spirit includes a wide variety of non-combat functions. Consequently, when considering what cuts to make to the CAF, we might frame the question a different way. It often depends just how you frame the question, and this is my cut at it, is it better for the animal to lose a tooth or two or a significant part of its brain? And, I was talking to some of the headquarters people yesterday who were involved in planning and implementation, and they said, yeah, well, people are saying, we're part of the tail to be cut. I said, well, actually, no. If you were actually going to use a biological metaphor, you'd be the brain. So you might ask people, would you rather have half your brain scooped out or lose a couple of teeth? People might look at that question a little differently. So let's wrap it up, because I'm over time. In conclusion, a few points from the presentation. Ethical problems tend to be blamed on bad individuals, but systemic problems are more pervasive and can be more damaging to the institution. To the 3 CAF systemic barriers that I talked about and that are here, we might add the hypermasculine, sexualized American warrior culture in light of the challenges the CAF faces in dealing with unethical behavior related to sexual misconduct, and especially with all the focus that's being put on Operation Honor right now. And I've been ending all my presentations with something like that, with the last point: the behavior you reward is the behavior you get. And, to me, if you have to take one thing away from this, it's that one. Because I don't know how many times we put in transformations, reforms, you name it, all sorts of ways to change the organization, but then the reward systems don't match the change. And what happens is people behave like you would expect them to do. You reward them for it, they're going to do it. So if you set up a change and you don't set up a reward system that parallels the change, I guarantee you're not going to get the change. I don't want to be too pessimistic on that, but after having studied this subject for a number of years, I think that to me is the key one, and it's also one of the hardest ones because reward systems are embedded in cultures. And with that, I would like to conclude and throw the floor open to Stephen. Questions, whatever you like.